Hi, I'm Adam and I'm recording this video on chesswithcanard.com. Today we're going to be discussing an important idea in rook endgames. This defensive idea is known as Vancura's defense. So in this position we'll be playing with the white pieces. Black is up a pawn and black's pawn is heading towards the bottom of the board. So recently we've looked at a very similar position to this, where black's pawn is on the second rank instead of the third rank. And there are a few important differences between these two positions. So briefly, in this, again, there's already a video on this position, so I'd recommend watching that. But briefly, white's defensive idea in this position is to leave the rook behind the pawn. So let's say rook over here, in order to prevent it from promoting and stop the rook from moving out in front of it. Another important thing white needs to do in this particular endgame is leave the king between these two squares. Because if the king strays to f2, black can go rook here, preparing the queen. And if we take the pawn, black can check us and win our rook. And if the king were to go to g3, black would simply give a check and queen on the next turn. So that's a very brief description of what happens to the pawns on the second rank. Now, the key difference between that and this endgame is that because the pawn is one square further away, black's king will be more effective in assisting the pawn if we go for the same idea. Because in the previous one, with the pawn here, if black's king ever gets to, let's say, the b3 square, we can simply check it away, and it will be forced to run away from the pawn because it has nowhere to hide. However, if we go for the same idea, and black's king were to eventually run over, now once we give a check, black can simply go king a2, and the next move they'll go rook b1, let's say move away, rook b2, let's say king b1, and they will eventually push their pawn with their king's assistance. So this is to say that we have to come up with a new defensive idea, as rook to a8 will no longer do. However, it's still important to keep our rook attacking this pawn, because if we play a random move, like let's say rook h8, then black will move their rook out of the way first, let's say rook b1, and now if we cover, we'll get rook b2 check, king, and let's say a2. And now all of a sudden it's a much more difficult task for white to defend this endgame, because again, black's king will be able to hide in front of the pawn to assist it in promoting. So we don't want to allow black's rook to move away from the defense of the pawn. So we need to find a way to stop this from happening without going behind the pawn, because this doesn't work. Another thing we need to do is we need to be prepared when black's king eventually runs towards the pawn. We need to be able to force it out of this sort of box on this part of the board. Because if we leave it in there, then it will be very useful in helping black's pawn promote. So the only move that does both of these things is rook to f3. So instead of attacking the pawn from behind, we'll instead attack from the side. If black ever pushes the pawn, we can now go behind this, and we've reached a very similar endgame to the one where our rook is on a8 and the pawn's on a. It's the exact same idea. So assuming black doesn't push the pawn, and black instead runs with their king into the position, now white can simply shuffle and wait for black's king to get close to the pawn. Let's say rook f3. And after king b4, now is another important moment. So black's king is defending the pawn. So if we do nothing, this will free up black's rook to move out of the way of the pawn and make black's task much easier. So now we have to force black's king away from the defense of the pawn. So again, the only way we can do this is by giving checks. And if black's king runs in, now we see the key difference between the rook being at the side instead of being behind. Because now, when black's king goes to hide in front of the pawn, we can simply force it out by repeatedly checking the king. And there will be no way for black to avoid these checks. So eventually black will have to run out of the position, and the process will start again. And actually there's no good way for black to make progress in these positions. Because if black ever pushes the pawn, we go behind. And when black ever goes with the king, we give checks. And the game should be saved. So thank you for watching, and goodbye.